Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Michael Belch, and as always, I'm joined by my brother, Bradley Belch. And today we are going to be reflecting on the interview that we had with Kevin Canale about land use and food. And that was a super interesting conversation. If you haven't heard that interview with Kevin, you'll want to probably go back and listen to that before you listen to our reflection on it, because it'll make a lot more sense what we're talking about. We're not going to go over every single point of his that he made or that we asked. We're going to use some of the things he said and kind of spin off with some ideas that we had about that. The reason that we do this, these follow-up episodes, is we want to try to understand not just the ideas, but also how can Christians participate in living a life that honors God in all areas, but also in thinking about how they can help society through the power of the gospel move in directions that are pleasing to God, embrace practices that are both pleasing to God, good for society, and might even expose the idols and the sinfulness that our society clings to at times. So our goal here, we say it every week, is to rebuild society in a way that honors God, and we're excited to think about land use and food again, as we were talking with Kevin. You'll hear in our discussion tonight that this is a topic that we are still kind of processing and thinking about. And the reason I point that out is legitimately, we want this podcast to serve as an encouragement to you to think issues through biblically. And tonight we're going to be thinking it through. We don't have quite as many conclusions as sometimes we do, but we're going to just tell you our thoughts and the questions that we still have. And hopefully even that process will encourage you to, if you hear something on our podcast or on someone else's podcast, to say, I'm not sure about that, but I want to take time. I want to think it through. I want to try and apply what I know about the Bible and about the world as God has made it to this question. And really a conviction that Bradley and I have that's growing deeper and deeper is that Christians need to be able to think things through. And we need to be able to ask questions of how we live, of practices that we have, of philosophies that we have. And nothing really gets overlooked maybe as easily as what we put in our mouth, because life is busy and we eat on the run and we're trying to make food for kids before we get out the door to soccer practice. And we are lucky if we get the lawn mowed once a week or once every couple of weeks. And sometimes that's the extent to which we think about food and land use. And so we want to encourage you that this is something that you can process and think through in a biblical way along with us. And if you have interesting ideas about it, we would definitely love to hear from you about how you are trying to wrestle with these ideas as you hear us wrestling with them. So all that being said, Bradley, any introductory comments from you as we get started on Kevin, the interview that we had with Kevin?
Yeah, there's not a whole lot that I can refer to biblically. So a lot of specifically right now, I think the biblical principles are there. So my only caveat to today's discussion is more of just principled life, just thinking through things and trying to be clear about things that we're thinking through. And the Bible needs to be a part of that. I just haven't, it's hard to think about scripture and think about the land use texts. We have the dominion mandate, the creative nature of life. We have the mandate that man's going to toil. The curse of man is that he toils as he works for food, or the promise, I should say, of that curse. So those are some basic realities, but I think there's more to be dug into there. Today is just going to kind of be more maybe theoretical discussion. Not that it can't take practical steps into our life, but I don't have a lot of texts to quote directly on the matter right now.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that I want to say is that I think it's a biblical principle to work, right? We know we're commanded to work, but I think it's also a biblical principle to work in a way where you're doing something productive. I think that God designed the earth to be fruitful, and He designed us to steward that fruitfulness. Even under the fall, where the earth works against us to some degree, and where our sinful judgment and impulse is to make creation a god or an idol, or to be lazy, or to misuse, to use the earth for our own personal advantage. Nevertheless, I think it's good for us to think and have in the back of our mind that in many ways we are stewarding the fruitfulness of the earth as we carry out our jobs, as we raise our kids, as we participate in society. And that idea of, we're not going to get into it a lot, but stewarding the earth in a way that gives life to the earth rather than just taking life out of it was a very interesting and I think very biblical idea. I don't know what to do with it, but it struck me as very Tolkien-like as he described stewardship in The Lord of the Rings. You have the stewards of Gondor who were doing it badly, and then you had the elves who in many ways were stewards of the natural world around them and had done it well. And this idea that we participate in God's will and that it's good for us to think about our role in stewarding nature, I don't have a lot of specifics, except that idea has kind of lodged itself in my mind, and I've been turning it over and over and over, and it'll continue to bounce around in my head for a little while.
Yeah, I think the topic of homesteading, of husbandry, gardening is part of that homesteading. Kind of I view the term gardening more as just a hobby. So that those are slightly distinct in my mind, but the whole topic of all of it can kind of be broken down into two directions. One, there's the individual direction. So what it does just for you as an individual, and as a person, and as a family, and then there's kind of the direction of what it means for society at large. And that's where you start getting into the locally sourced food, organic food, like you're talking about, just kind of the sustainability of this is the order that God created. And when we do things in the way that God created or dictates, the soil's healthier, the animals are healthier, the crops are healthier. They're still all under the fall of the curse. But there are ways to do it in a way that conforms with the closest proximity to the way God intended it, while still under a fall. So in terms of the personal, though, as you were talking about that, I mean, it does strike me, and I think it's important to remind people that the man starts in a garden. God places him in a garden specifically, and there is goodness there. In the language of the Bible throughout the Old Testament, and then even into the New Testament and some Revelation, points back to the imagery of the garden. And in a lot of ways, the Jewish symbolism for the Jewish people was full of imagery about the garden, because the garden is where we will be restored fully to our relationship with God. That's where we started with God, and eventually we will finish there with God in a garden. So I think there's just a practical, like, as we read the Bible, and if we are simultaneously gardening, there's just a practical. This is not just a passive hobby, but there's richness and fullness in thinking about the fellowship and communion that we have with God while doing that process, and then also a longing for what's to come. That I think is an interesting biblical principle too.
Yeah, and I think if you garden with your kids, the object lessons are just low-hanging fruit to use a gardening analogy, right? I mean, just, talking with your kids about if it gets too hot, if God brings a hot spring, our plants might die. And that's within God's providence. And we rely on God's providence, even for our food. What does it mean for a vine to be healthy, a plant to be healthy? What does it mean for it to grow? What does it mean for us to bear fruit? The fruit of our relationship with Christ. And what does it mean to bear much fruit versus little fruit? I mean, that is very true what you're saying, that there is an immediate connection to the way that God and Christ and the writers of the Bible understand many areas of our life. So that's a very well taken point, Bradley.
Yeah. Then getting into the other aspect of the personal side of things, just the kind of self-sufficiency direction of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to dive into that aspect. My only point of clarification here is that we don't intend to say, and Kevin didn't intend to say that we are to be ever fully self-sufficient necessarily, but that wherever we're at, whether it's an apartment or acreage with a full garden that can do a lot of our summer produce, we could be pursuing the idea of self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to spin that off.
There's an interesting principle that Kevin touched on, which was the principle of Christian freedom, where Christians ought to be able to live in a way where they can provide for their family and for themselves. And verses that I think of are in Romans, I think 14, it says, "Oh man, nothing, be indebted to no one except to love." And then also the verse that says in 1 Thessalonians, I think, to aspire to live a quiet, peaceful life and work with our hands. And there's an idea that we're to live in a way. The other example that I was thinking of was Paul said over and over again that he was not dependent on anyone financially. He was a tent maker. That's where we get that word. And he not only supported himself, but the people that traveled with him. And there's a good goal, I think, that Christians are freed from sin. We are free to live in a way that honors God. And so we're free to apply the principles of the Bible in an act of worship and service to God. But a lot of those principles are principles of productivity and of fruitfulness. They are principles of marriage. They are principles of personal piety. But so many of our disciplines come out in how we work and in how we use our time. And I think as we talked with Kevin and as I thought about it, the idea of being self-sufficient as Christians is good. Obviously, we live in society. We're not going to we're not preppers. I don't think that's what he was talking about. We're not going to go live in the woods on our own and forage and totally cut ourselves off from society. But to be in a position where financially and even with our food, we have a measure of being able to provide for ourselves, it is, I think, a biblical idea. Working with your hands, providing for yourself, not being indebted to anyone. These are good things that Christians ought to aspire to do. Again, what I appreciated so much about Kevin's comments was that this is something that we can achieve, or we can aspire to achieve, that we can work towards, that we can think and pray, God, what would it mean for me to be more self-sufficient in a way where I'm not relying on, this thing or that government program or whatever it might be. So the idea of self-sufficiency and food was an encouraging and challenging one for me to think about.
Yeah, and the more you pursue that, the more dependent you become on God's provision in that. Now, we are more than likely always going to have the option of going and buying whatever it is that we grow in the garden from the store. But if we start out with just a potted tomato, there's not a whole lot of dependency whether the potted tomato produces or not. But if we start to physically actually go, you know what, I've been doing this for 5 years. I don't want to buy another onion again in my life. We just finished our onions from last year's season. My goal is to not buy another onion in my life. It may seem trivial and trite and like kind of silly, but we can trust in some of God's provision in that, knowing that ultimately He's going to take care of us, and when we need to buy an onion, we're going to be able to buy an onion. But if we set the mindset as, I'm going to trust God to make this the way that we make salsa. Lori, my wife, makes an incredible salsa out of all the stuff that we grow in the garden, and we freeze it. This is our second year doing it in a row, and we still enjoy the fruits of that labor. And now we almost can't buy salsa anymore because it's just not as good. So it's we have the ability to buy things again at the store, but there's a certain, like, I look forward to having that provision because it is good. It is good to enjoy the fruits of those labors. So I think we can become dependent on God's provision. I think it is safe to say that God is providing for my salsa needs. Silly, but I would be sad if I don't, if that weren't to come. So, if God can work to produce, to be faithful in the production of that yield, then that's a small way that God has provided a goodness. I can enjoy in the goodness of what He's provided for me. Is the long and the short of it. Again, it does seem silly, but there is there's something to that, to just seeing God, to enjoying the goodness of what He gives us.
Yeah. Ecclesiastes. Oh, that's not the word. That's not the one I was looking for. Ecclesiastes says in several places that I can't remember the exact reference of right now. Oh, yeah, it is. 3. I'll read 11 through 13. Says, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to the end. Then Solomon or whoever the writer is says this: I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. And everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. I think it's interesting that he uses the word toil that was used in Genesis after the curse. Should take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. And the idea here is that under the curse, toil is wearisome and futile. But under God's grace and under God's blessing, toil can be enjoyable again. And to reap the rewards of what you have produced is one of the blessings that we are commanded to enjoy and to delight in. Obviously, not apart from a thankfulness and a gratitude to God within that, but it's good, and not only okay, but it's proper for Christians to delight in their work and to enjoy the fruit of their labor in joyful worship and thankfulness to God.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I want to be really careful to be clear. We've said it before. We've kind of touched on it, but what we are talking about is not a passive, oh, wouldn't it be cute to go plant a cherry tomato bush? What we are talking about is an intentional mindset of pursuing self-sufficiency and God's provision in our life and working with our hands in a way that is honoring to Christ. It's not, because lots of people garden, like I said, lots of people garden as a hobby. And they just kind of, they just kind of do it for fun, casual.
Or as preppers who are terrified of the end of the world and are really enslaved to that fear.
Yeah. But but what I'm saying is that when we garden or when we homestead or whatever it is that we were growing, we should be growing that with a mindset of this is good. But both the work that is put into it is good. The fruit is good. It's not just it is rewarding. There is a joy in doing it. But it's not just a fad and it's not just a hobby. It's intentional, increasingly productive time. So increasing, Kevin talked about it, set goals and each year do a little bit more, set a little higher goal. And so my only point is that the mindset does matter here. Yeah. When we approach the topic of gardening versus homesteading, I guess.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Well, Bradley, as we were thinking through this topic, you brought up an interesting point that maybe we can pivot into now about kind of the ideal of stewarding the earth, whether individually or working towards global solutions, which I don't think we're going to get into as much here. Maybe we will. But the legitimate concern about kind of the corporatization of farms, of fisheries, of forests. Those are all F's. And do you want to spin off on that for a little bit?
Yeah, we live in such a commercialized capitalist market, and we are told to be stewards of God's money, which typically means buy the cheapest, most convenient product, because if we do that, then we're being frugal, we're being wise with our money, we're being careful. And I'm not entirely convinced that that is necessarily wise with our money. I think the capitalist system is set up. It is what I'm not saying is that capitalism is bad. Capitalism is the best possible economic system for the freedom of man. It is. But when we allow it to run rampant without any checks, and specifically moral checks, when there's no moral principles governing it, when we don't take into account what are the implications of this on the individual level, on the small farmer level, on the state level, federal level, when we don't have moral principles curbing it or influencing capitalism, then capitalism can be just as perverse as anything else in the fallen world.
Yep.
So for farming specifically, and fisheries and forestry, like you mentioned, that we should be concerned, or at least have some level of awareness that food will lack of food will bend many knees. Like if you can't eat, that is one of the most viable places that your knee will be bent, is a desperation for food. And I'm not saying, like you say, I'm not saying doom and gloom preppers. That's not what I'm saying, but we should take some level of concern in saying, we just want to be cautious and wise about, the enlargement of one industry in being swallowed into a capitalist system. And we can take small steps as consumers of food to say, is it worth it? And this is where I was talking about, wisdom with food. Is it wise to buy the cheapest thing, or is there a level of wisdom in saying, okay, it's going to cost me a little bit more. There might be some financial sacrifice there, but the money that I am giving towards it is supporting something that either promotes a better sustainable way of growing things, like we touched on earlier in the episode. It's a more natural way that God has told us to use the earth. So either that, or we just have a legitimate concern of anything that gets too big is purely and utterly corruptible, and you can't fight back against that. So I don't have a clear answer here, or even directive. I just want us as Christians to be thinking through what the implications of the way we buy food are.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's clear or if that's too doom and gloom, but that's kind of my thought on the matter there. And it spills over into other areas. We don't necessarily have to get there, but you can break it all the way down to the sandals that you wear on your feet. So
yeah. It is an interesting. There have always been the idea of markets. I don't mean free market here. I mean, people will bring their things into town. They will sell them. People will gather at the marketplace. Where we grew up, Bradley, I think it was Thursday, that the farmers would all bring their stuff into town. Mom would go down to the market. She would buy the groceries for the week. And so the idea of gathering somewhere to buy food and goods and things like that, I think it's been around as long as commerce has been around in human society. But what you're talking about is not just the exchange of money or goods, or money or services for goods such as food, but a large commercialization of the industry. And I've been thinking about this a little bit with healthcare. What is the difference between medicine and the medical system, right? And what is the difference between food and the food system? I don't know, the process by which food is produced and sold. Again, we're not saying stop going to the grocery store. I think what we are saying is this bears some thought. And I don't know a lot of people who are thinking about it. I think there's an author named Wendell Berry who's done some good work on this. I read a little bit of him before. So I'm not sure about him, but it bears thought and consideration. And I think this really is a key that we want to say is the Christian life, it bears thinking about things. It bears thinking about questions that maybe you don't know the answer to. Maybe you think about it for a while. And it bears examination, just in a way of saying, God, am I living, am I thinking, am I acting in the way that you want me to in this area? What we're not saying is you have to spend, 6 hours a day examining every area of your life right now this week. But I think there is a principle here of periodically you need to be considering the faceted areas of your life, your practices, and what is culture telling us to do? What is the grocery store telling us to do? Like, why do they put, for a simple example, why do they put the candy right where you check out? They want you to buy that. Are we thinking about what they're trying to tell us? I don't know if people are type A personality, maybe they're going to write a schedule where, 4 times a year, I'm going to think about a significant issue and we'll have a family meeting about it. I don't know. This idea of thinking through life and thinking through the implications of Christian practice and belief. Bradley, thoughts on that?
What this is in pursuit of, I think, is the idea that the church should have a culture outside of the confines of the walls of the church.
Yeah.
The church should give both.
Let me
freedom
pause you right there before you get. Do you mean an individual church or the church in general? What are you saying, kind of specifically? Because that would be a really big implication.
I am saying both.
Okay.
I'm saying individual churches, but then also a network and a community of churches at large. But more specifically, I would say an individual church, as much as possible. We should give our members both the freedom and the encouragement and the directive to pursue the things that they are good at, regardless of the culture that we live in. We need Christian farmers just as much as we need Christian doctors or Christian lawyers or Christian tech people. We need our church to be well-rounded, both for the sufficiency of the church, but also because when you know that somebody's at your church that is has an orchard, an apple orchard, and you buy your apples from them, you have a contact point with them outside of the church, that gives you an opportunity to meet with them, to encourage them, to help them, to the money that you're giving to them, is going towards the kingdom because they are part of the kingdom, but also because then they're going to turn around and they're going to use that money for the world. So I think what I'm driving at here or trying to is that the broader our churches the broader an individual church's range is, and if we're talking specifically about farming here, the more community that we are going to be able to foster and build, leading to, ultimately it'd be great if the Christian church was self-sufficient on its own. We have our medical provider, our lawyers, our farmers, our butchers, our mechanics, our builders. We have all of these people, so that we can know with confidence. And I think there's that we're supporting good causes and good people. But also, I think there's a richness and a joyness that is endearing to that draws people in. That I think is really valuable. So that's, so as we think about that, can we be pursuing those things? Can we find the person in our church that has the ability to start pursuing cattle farming? It's not glamorous, but we all eat beef. And there's somebody who's going to find there's lots of people who find great joy in raising cattle and taking care of cattle. But we don't foster that, and we don't encourage that well as a Christian church now at large is what I'm talking about. And I think that's kind of what Kevin is getting at, is we build a network of people, specifically believers, that becomes more and more influential to the society around us.
Yeah. One of the things that, as we dialogued with Kevin before our interview with him, that he said that we didn't get a chance to talk about in the interview was the principle. I think it's in that same passage in 1 Thessalonians 4, where we want to live, work with our hands and live a quiet and peaceful life. I think right after that, it talks about so that you may have extra to share with those who are in need. And that is what you're describing, Bradley, I think is good. I mean, the church has been known through history for giving to those in need. And that was one of the things that really turned the tide in Rome, was the Christians who were being persecuted were ministering and sharing during the fallout of the fire. And the idea of self-sufficiency is not only self-sufficiency, but rather it is preparation for future generosity and love and service towards other people. We have a meal for our church every Saturday evening. And one of the families this last Saturday brought, must have been about 20 jars of pickled goods, cucumbers, watermelon rind, all sorts of stuff. And they had a ton of canned goods, and they just brought it to bless the church. Sometimes we stop at the store and buy cut up fruit, and that's okay. But I was just like, man, they have prepared in a way where they have extra to the point where they can just bring this whole tray and bless us. And it's not that we want to be insular and only focused on the church, but that is an attractive, appealing light to the world when they see that kind of 1, community, 2, willingness to help, and 3, forethought and preparedness to be able to bless the people in the church. And that would spill over to the community, I'm sure, too, as it can.
And 4, being excellent at it.
Yes.
Always in a pursuit of excellence, to the best of the ability that God has gifted us with. It's interesting as we talk about this, I can't help but think about the Amish community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have a lot of things that I think is valuable to what we're talking about. Now, I mean, they're known for, like, people go to Amish country to buy quality furniture. They go there to buy quality vegetables, fruit, produce, milk, cheese. I mean, people who have access to that go there specifically because they know what they're getting. Now, where I think the Amish get it a little bit wrong is they're a bit of internally focused. They have a harder time taking that and extending it beyond their community. But I think what they do in Amish country is really, really kind of a beautiful thing that they are self-sufficient. I mean, they're speaking about self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
And they try the best that they know how, to keep to the practices of God's word. They are thinking through it. Again, I'm not saying let's all go be Amish. But there are principles from that I think would be valuable if we at least looked into and said, what are they, how are they doing this? How are they being this self-sufficient? And what elements of that can we take and can we incorporate into the body? And it starts with some personal accountability, both in producing stuff and thinking about the way that we are consuming stuff as well.
Yeah. But to that point, like, just in our conversation that we had with Kevin, I realized there's a lot more to think about in this area than I ever imagined that I could think about. Biblical principles, wisdom principles. And again, I just want to echo your comment to call Christians within the church to not just be a farmer, but to develop a culture of what does godly farming look like? To not just be a businessman, but to develop an understanding of what godly business practices and business are, to think biblically. And I don't think it's necessarily reasonable that a pastor is going to have all of the answers to all of those things. Pastor can provide the principles and the framework, but some of it is going to be the farmer who's thinking about that, or talking with other farmers. What does it mean to honor God in this area, or the businessmen? We have an obligation to seek out a biblical understanding in the field or areas that we are working. And hopefully within your church, that is welcomed, and even like the wisdom that you're learning is put on display to some degree or another through discipleship or mentoring, or again, biblical framework from the word through the pastor. But part of the onus is on us in the different fields that we live in to think through, how do we do this well with skill, but how do we do this in a way that is distinctively biblical and distinctively Christian?
Yeah, I completely agree. As we say this, it's easy for us to talk in this way without any action. And we don't propose action, not because we don't think we can get there, but because we don't necessarily know the answer. What we're saying is, if you are in a specific field, it is your responsibility to figure out what those biblical principles are. It's our responsibility in our fields to think about what those biblical principles are. And that is not easy. And it can't be sloughed off as to, oh, well, I'm just working hard. There are principles. And the second thing I want to say there is more than likely that will look radically different than what the other people doing the same job are doing. The end result might be the same, but the way you go about it, the principles that you have while doing it, it is going to look different almost, I think I can say with confidence, in almost every circumstance, because God's word is distinctly different and set apart from everything in the world. And so the way we go about things will look different. You cannot just do your job the same way that a secularist would do their job and think that that is a biblical way of doing it. Even if the secularist is doing a good job or doing good work, as Christians, there is going to be a distinction drawn somewhere, and we should be finding what those distinctions are. Otherwise, we're just living in the world, right? That I'm thinking out loud now mostly, but otherwise we're just living in the same manner that a non-believer is living.
Yeah. Well, I think of a very surface level application, and hopefully we will be able to go deeper in our fields of thought in the areas where we work. But one is businesses that close on Sunday, Christian businesses that close on Sunday. I mean, that is radically different because you're not maximizing your profit. You're not open for all those customers who would come in on a Sunday. It's like, well, okay, it is different, and maybe I will make less money. And that's going to look, very strange to the world where making money is the primary purpose of a business. You're right. It will look very different. And even in deeper and deeper ways, I think it'll look different as Christians live and work in ways that are biblical and Christianly.
Yep. And we don't have the answers again. It's going to take time, but what we are encouraging is that we take the time. We do our diligence. More now than we ever have before. And that we don't get complacent on it. We don't just say, well, I can't think of anything all that good. Have the conversations. You said the pastors don't necessarily need to have the answers, but I do think the pastors need to be fostering the dialogue and the conversations.
Agreed.
They certainly will not have all the answers in everything. But you should be able to go to your pastor or your whoever's, whoever you're counting on for accountability and ministry and say, look, I really want to be Christian in this. What does it look like, to set myself apart? How can I set myself apart? Not what I am not saying is as a Christian, because that is easy. It is easy to tell how we can live differently. I'm saying, how do you work differently? And some of that work is going to be the interaction you have with your coworkers, right? That's going to look different. But I think there is something in the actual work we are doing that will look different. Beyond what we should look like. We should look different as Christians, just period, in our personal life and the way we interact with people. But the work itself should have some mark of difference.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that is part of what it means when Jesus says, you are the light of the world, and you are sitting on a hill. We live and work and do everything that we do for the glory of God because we do it in a way that is pleasing to him. And that will be different in many cases than how everyone else is doing it.
Yep. Well, I don't have a whole lot more to add.
That seems like a really good place to end it. Since we're talking about that idea, if you are someone or someone who really has thought through a particular area of life or society in a really clear biblical way, maybe, obviously not everyone is you're not ever going to have all the answers. But if you are someone or someone who has thought through a particular area, whether it's, sports or recreation or economics or whatever the case may be, in a biblical way and in a way that can help the rest of the church and society know how God wants us to live in that area, please feel free to contact us, and we'll do the legwork and follow up if it's someone else or we'd be happy to talk with you about the potential of coming on the podcast and helping us think through another one of these areas in a biblical way. And that, again, that's our goal here on Rebuild, is we want to rebuild, not according to our own image or according to our own wisdom, but according to God's wisdom. And so we hope that you can participate with us in that. We hope that as we think through these issues and we present them to you, they're challenging and encouraging to you, and help you know how to live and how to worship Christ through your service more and more every single day. So it'd be interesting to have a spinoff part of what we're doing here at Rebuild, to where we have, as to look for people who have thought about these things or are thinking about these things, in specific fields. So if we know nurses that have thought about how Christian nursing looks like, or if we have carpenters, I'll think about it from my own perspective. What does that look like? Distinctly different. Educators, even if it's just realtors, administrative work, insurance salesmen. I mean, if we were able to do kind of a round table, almost a round table, or even just because right now our format is a little bit heavier with a bigger picture topic, and then the follow up what we're doing now. Right. But if we added a third one that was not a regimented, we're trying to get it one a week, but just as they come up, hey, so and so is a nurse and they have something to say about this, and just have that casual conversation. So I guess round table a little bit. It'd be interesting to see. So if that's you, or if that's something you wanted to help organize. Yeah, absolutely. All right. As always, you can find out more about us and all of our content on our website, rebuildpodcast.com. Also, our YouTube channel by the same name, and Twitter handle by the same name as well. So thank you so much for joining us and checking out this episode. We look forward to having you along for the next one as well. Appreciate it. Yeah.